Marcy Hedi. Tanchi, Pat Carrabré Dishnikashun, Red River Oshchinia, Maka Vancouver Niwakinikwa. So I'm also doing my best to learn my native language, Michif, which is something that I didn't grow up with. So I said, my name is Pat Carrabré. I'm originally from Red River in Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, and I now live here in Vancouver. So thank you all for coming out on such a beautiful day to share a little bit of time with me here as I talk about decolonizing my creative process and my path in embracing indigeneity. So as you'll see here, my full name legally is Thomas Patrick Carrabré, but that's not the name that I was born with. Ronald Joseph Nault is the name that I was born with. So I was part of what now is commonly called the Sixties Scoop, where the government of Canada had an official policy of taking Indigenous children away from their families and placing them with white families. So I grew up passing white, and as did many Métis kids in my generation. In fact, not too long ago, about a year ago, I met my younger brother, who was also adopted out, and of all places, we met in Madrid, Spain, because his family moved out of Canada, and he's been in Slovenia ever since. So we also have 4 wonderful sisters in Winnipeg, so we have all been reunited, and we're very fortunate to have each other. So I'm a composer, as Hetty said. Also, throughout most of my career, I've been a university administrator. I guess it would have been a little over 30 years ago that I took up the job of Dean of Music at Brandon University. So I've been doing administration and creative work as a professor through all those years. So I was born in Winnipeg, so I'm an uninvited guest here. Very honored to have a very good working relationship with the folks at Xmaskwim, where University of British Columbia has its territory, but also with friends in Squamish and some in Snewíyalh as well. And the being a Métis person is something that's maybe a little bit less well understood than some of the other Indigenous groups in Canada. There are 3 official categories of Indigenous folks that are recognized. And so the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis. And the Métis have a kind of interesting history. We are a new Indigenous community that developed after Europeans came to North America. So we are the product of people, as it says here, mixed European and Indigenous ancestry, and one of these 3 recognized groups. And I'll talk a little bit more about the role of the Métis in becoming part of Canada in a few minutes. So the use of the term Métis is kind of complex and really very contentious across a number of communities and has different historical and contemporary meanings. So it depends on where you are in Canada, what your language is, and what your kind of perspective is. So the federal government a number of years ago decided to have Métis as a category on the census. And for many people in Canada, the term Métis simply means mixed. So you are of mixed blood. So over the last 40 or 50 years, the Métis community has tried to clearly identify the various components of our community. So I'm from the Red River Métis, and to become a citizen of the Red River Métis, you have to show that your family owned land in Red River before it was part of Canada. So my ancestors came from France. My European ancestors came from France in the 1600s, lived in Quebec for a while, and then moved to Manitoba in the 1700s. You can, and I've seen the map of Red River, the actual Red River, and the collection of what they called wrongs. So they each had lots that moved out from the river out into a wood lot at back. So you had access both to the river for transportation and for fish, and you had access to wood so that you could heat your house in the winter. So a number of people in my family tree were landowners. When this would have been at the time when the Hudson Bay Company was essentially the government of any part of Canada west of Ontario, and you know, you can. I would highly recommend the book "The Northwest is Our Mother" by Jean Taillé, who's an amazing lawyer and writer who lives here in Vancouver, who's also Métis. Turns out we're second cousins or third cousins, something like that. And we're doing a project right now. But her book on the history of the Métis in Canada is really the gold standard for helping to understand how we fit into the fabric of Canada. But to join, you not only have to show your family-owned land, but you have to show your family tree back to that time period. And so when I received my family tree from the St. Boniface Historical Society, at the back they also show what's called the Métis script. So the idea is when Louis Riel negotiated entry into Canada for the Métis and for Manitoba, the Canadian government agreed to give the Métis the equivalent of the land that they lived on, not necessarily in the same place, but they agreed to give what's called a scrip, which was a piece of paper that would get you the land. Unfortunately, there was some pretty awful land speculation involved at that period of time, and so almost all the Métis land has been stolen. So at the back you get script with your ancestor's name and an X where they took it into the government and said, well, they don't know how to write, so they just sold me the land. Here's their X to mark the spot. So you can see that, and then on the family tree, it usually also just says, you know, amable non, married Cree. So it doesn't even say the name of the person they were married to. They only are listed as Cree in the records of the time. So that's and in Manitoba there were the Métis, who at that time were mostly known as le bois brûlé, the burnt wood people, because our complexion was usually darker, or you were a half-breed. So if your male parent was Anglophone, you were a half-breed. If they were Francophone, you were bois brûlé. So we have, and as the government of Canada moved to take that Métis territory into Canada, the speculators from Ontario who were coming out and the homesteaders wanted to structure their world, the physical world, the way that they were used to in Ontario. So they wanted square lots. They didn't like the long ones coming off the water. They wanted square lots that they could turn into farms. And it was basically the Métis mostly moved out. There was quite a bit of rebellion, and unfortunately when the army came in and eventually they hung Louis Riel as a traitor because he did the same thing not only in Manitoba. He was expelled from Canada at that point. He came back when they tried to do the same thing in Saskatchewan, and that's when he was hung. So the Métis essentially went into hiding. So in my family, when I talked to my birth mother, she said, well, we were told just to say we were French. We weren't, if I told anyone I was Métis, I got into really serious trouble. So there are a lot of small villages in Manitoba that are Métis villages that were just considered to be Francophone villages. And so the confusion goes on, because then more in our time, many people who are of mixed race between First Nations or Inuit and European heritage consider themselves Métis, because that's the only thing they can identify on the census that comes close to what they are. And in most cases now they're trying to move towards being classified as non-status First Nations or non-status Inuit, because in those days, if the female had a child with a white person, they lost their Indigenous status. So they lost their ability to live on reserve. They lost their treaty rights. And so now we have a process where many people are trying to get back their treaty rights. And it's one of the things within our communities that is challenging, because trying to figure out who can live where and who can have land and who has rights to access is quite complicated. So even within the Métis community right now, I was at meetings in Vancouver 2 months ago, because we're getting ready to enter into a new treaty with the federal government that will give the Red River Métis the rights that they should have had under the previous agreements. But it means that anyone who has registered with the BC Métis groups has to give up that citizenship and reclaim their Red River citizenship if they want their rights, based on what was in Manitoba, because the rights are very different depending on what part of the country you're in. So it's a complicated world, but I'm very proud to be part of my community and to learn later in life many of the details about how my family grew up and the relationships that we have to the land in various parts of the country. So, and I'm just, part of this is also to give some information for school kids, because they'll have access to this information. So in 1950, Métis was a dirty word on the prairies. And there was almost no advantage to claiming Métis heritage at that time, and a lot to lose. I've seen documents from the 1960s put out by the Manitoba Métis Federation. There was one booklet I was particularly shocked to find and read, and it was called Truths About the Métis. And in about the third page in, it says, "Are all Métis drunks?" That's a question that people often asked back in those days. And the answer was, no, all Métis aren't drunks, probably about the same percentage as the Irish and the Polish and the English. You know, so it's a little bit of learning, you know, but trying to figure out how to help people understand the difference between all these different communities. And there are articles on hiding in plain sight. It's become, was the National Archives of Canada put on a big exhibit about Métis history in Canada, and how many Métis people were not known to be Métis, and they were quite successful in the country, but would just say, yes, I'm Francophone, or I'm First Nations, or whatever depending on how they presented to the public, they would use that to help people to understand who they were. So one of the things, as someone who grew up white, and I have a PhD from a big American university, I've been to a number of universities in Canada, I've taught at several universities, so I'm what I call well and truly colonized. I mean, it's very easy for me to just assume the colonial approach to life. And really this idea is that there's a kind of superiority and privilege to how Western thought is positioned in the world. It is right. It is the most important thing. It is the most powerful thing, however white society wants to position things. And that's one of those challenges, especially for someone who works in a post-secondary institution, when you're trying to be more inclusive, you're trying to understand different points of view. We now talk a lot about multiple epistemologies, because for us now, particularly as Indigenous people, there is no one true right. You know, there is perspective. And as a classical musician trained in the very rigorous tradition, I thought 30 years ago that I knew what a good piece of music was. I thought I knew what the characteristics were. I thought I could say, yes, that is a good piece of music, and that is not as good a piece of music. You know, whatever your criteria was, whether you like Beethoven the most or Bach the most or whatever, but you could tell that Dittersdorf was not as good a composer. You just knew that, right? And definitely someone from a tradition where it wasn't written down did not have as much value. So trying to figure out how to decolonize myself, because it's very easy for me to fall back into those patterns because I was trained that way. I was trained that I am the composer. I say if that note is short or long. I say if that note is high or low. what the coloristic, it goes in the violin, not in the cello. That's my role. Whereas I'm trying to start rethinking about that, because the difference between a colonial point of view and an indigenous point of view is that one is wrapped more in personal relationships than the other. Western society tends to be very legalistic in its approach, whereas indigenous society is very personal in its approach. So as part of that, trying to work to I carry a meme around on my phone which has a little Yoda, and he says, "You must unlearn what you have learned." And I kind of take that to heart, because the idea is that I have all this training. Yes, I can write a fugue, I can write counterpoint, I can, do the things that need to be done, but is the value of what I'm trying to do to express who I am in this time, in this place, are those the best tools to do that? So trying to reclaim some of the indigenous knowledge systems and use those to transform how I position myself in the world and how my music interacts with the people that I'm interacting with or writing for. So here's a picture that I consider to be kind of prototypical of Western art music. So this is Beethoven at his piano. I've had the good fortune to be at one of the Beethoven museums in Vienna, where they have several of Beethoven's pianos. They have a map on the wall of Vienna with a pin for every place that Beethoven lived. And he must have lived in about 40 places in Vienna, because he was a horrible tenant. He made a lot of noise. He played piano all night long. He put his piano on the floor. As you can see, he was very messy. So he was not the kind of person that you would want as your neighbor. But he's a great genius. Right now, Beethoven went deaf partway through his career, so he had a lot of challenges that he was dealing with. But if let's say in one of my doctoral courses, we were looking at Beethoven's sketchbooks, and one of the things you do is you look at his communication books, because if he wanted to speak to someone, he had to write it out, and then they had to write their answer back to him, what they were saying. Well, interestingly, there's a lot of pages ripped out, and we assume that's because he had things to say that were not very nice. And his friends didn't want history to know that, so they ripped those pages out. So, Western art music, the great genius, right? And so if you take a moment and picture a composer genius, it's very likely to be someone like Amadeus from the movie, this crazy guy who was brilliant. Or Bach, toiling away over his keyboard with, 23 kids copying his music so that he could do all the brilliant things he was doing. Almost always they will be male, and they will have been a genius within this tradition that they were gifted. So as Evan Williams pointed out in an article in 2019, either implicitly or explicitly, this tradition excludes women and people of color. It's very, very difficult to break into this European tradition. And part of it is that I don't know very many people who want to be a genius. I mean, you might think about it, but being a genius usually means you're really weird, and you probably die very young, and usually have bad things happen to you because the world does not understand you. So I've always struggled with this idea that I'm not a genius. I like to pay the mortgage when it's due. I like to go to a nice restaurant on a holiday, and stuff like that. But geniuses don't do things like that. And it's partly this singularity of vision that has seemed to be so important. That I read a very interesting article a couple of years back by a curator and composer, Sandeep Bhagwati, and he was talking about what he characterizes as the kind of militaristic vision of contemporary music, that it's very male-dominated and very aggressive. When I was a graduate student in New York, we knew to hate those people. We did not like that music or those people. We did not like that music or those people. We liked our music and our people. And the other ones were our enemies. And that's a tradition that goes back to the time when some very wealthy young men came back from the Crusades, and they didn't have anything to do. So they ended up starting musical societies. They'd started a number of other things, but musical societies, and they brought this kind of very aggressive militaristic vision back, and it has been at the core of a lot of contemporary music ever since that time. So we're in a time period where we're trying to embrace diversity, but before I get there, I mean, this concept kind of achieved an apex with the music of Richard Wagner, the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total artwork. He was the total genius that conceived of everything in the world wrapped together. Not only did he write the text and the music, and he conducted, and he was the director of the opera house, but he had the opera house made for his specific requirements. Like it was, he wanted complete control of everything. And that idea of trying to dominate the world is something that's very much at the center of Western European society. About a year ago, I was reading the Curse of the Nutmeg, I think. It's a fantastic book. But it talks about essentially how Europeans terraformed the rest of the continent to make it look the way that they were used to. So when they came to North America, they essentially replaced our native plants with their native plants. They brought over their animals and livestock and killed the bison that my people were living on. So this whole idea that you replicate what you want, it's a bit like the Borg. So trying to move past that kind of idea that I want to control the whole world is a little bit at the center about giving up control and entering into a different kind of relationship with the people that you're working with, the musicians who are playing your music, the other creative people who you want to include as part of your project. And as I said, some of this has to do with the Western legal system. So generally you go to the music store and you buy a piece of music and then you play it. You don't have to worry about who the composer was or how they get paid or what their position is or whether they would like or dislike what you're doing with their music. You paid for it, you can do it, right? Whereas in Indigenous communities, if you would like to learn a song, you must enter into a relationship with the person who created the song or someone who they have gifted the song to with the right to pass it on. And that you can only enter into that relationship if you have the right mind and heart. And so we had a show at the Chan Center a year and a half ago where a Métis singer and songwriter said, I'm going to sing a song that I was gifted. Please don't videotape it because I don't have permission to share it that way. I can share it with you live. And please don't try and sing along because you're not allowed to. You have to get permission from the person who created the song to sing along. So it's a very different way of thinking about what we do. So I want to start by, in terms of talking about my music, this work called Inuit Games, which was from 2002. It was commissioned by the Winnipeg Symphony and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And it was created in a collaborative process with Pauline and Inukshuk. Pauline Pemick is on the right, Inukshuk Akselnik is on the left. They're two dear friends of mine. And I mean, the story is a bit funny because it was one of these things where I had just become composer in residence at the Winnipeg Symphony. They said, would you write this piece? We need a piece with Inuit singers and orchestra together. And I said, no. Why would you think that would be a good thing for me to do? I don't know anything about Inuit music. I'm not from there. I can write the orchestra stuff, but why would I do that? And they said, oh, well, think about it. So at that time I was living in Brandon, so it was a 2-hour drive home. Sure enough, by the time I was about halfway home, I said, okay, if I don't agree to do this, they're going to ask someone who's going to do something really dumb. So I happened to be working a lot in northern Manitoba doing off-campus university, coordinating off-campus university courses. So I sent an email out and said, who's working with, or who has Inuit throat singers who are friends? Do you want to ask them if they think this is a stupid idea? Anybody want to talk about the possibility of doing this project? And within a week, Pauline was going to be in Winnipeg because she was in Iqaluit at that time, and people from Iqaluit have to go to Winnipeg if they need to go to the hospital. And she had a cousin who needed to go to the hospital, so she came down because her cousin didn't speak English, and so she was translator. So we met in the food court at the Polo Park Mall and said, is this a good idea? Should we collaborate on this kind of a project? And she was so excited and so generous about the idea of singing with the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra and sharing katajjak singing with a Southern audience that I sort of went, oh wow, okay, I can't not say yes now. I have to do this. So I agreed, and what I kind of saw my role as being a mediator. Now, this is a very traditional role for the Métis, to be a mediator between European society and Indigenous society. So I felt I can work with Pauline and Inukshuk, I can learn more about their musical tradition and how it may have things in common or not with Western music, and then we can try and find a place where we can share music between the two sides. So we managed to do that. They recorded their practice sessions for several months, and they sent me little, cassette tapes back in those days. And I would listen to the recordings, and I would play stuff on the piano, and then I would record what I was playing on the piano, and I would send it back to them. And then eventually I wrote the music for the orchestra, and then the orchestra recorded that and sent it up to them so they could be ready. Because as in Western culture, time is money, and they could only afford one rehearsal on the day of the concert, because the airfare for the two singers to get to Winnipeg was more than most people would make for playing the concert. So they weren't giving us a lot of time. But we were very fortunate. It was a beautiful experience. We toured the piece throughout northern Manitoba up to Churchill, where there was a gathering of Inuit elders, and so they were thankful to get the blessing of their elders for this project, and it's available on CD, it's available on Spotify, and then about a decade, and then the piece went on to be played quite a bit. The Toronto Symphony used to play it, Montreal Symphony, National Arts Centre Orchestra, they would play it, and in my naivete in those days, I thought, okay, there's probably going to be Inuit singers in Toronto and Ottawa, and that they'll just hire two other singers, they'll come in. It's fairly clear what needs to be done. There's half a dozen genres of throat singing, and it just says start one here and stop here. It never works out that way, and that's one of the beautiful things in my learning, because musicians who improvise, if they get excited, they just keep going. So in this performance, the first performance, the conductor goes like this, and they start singing, and then he goes like this, and they don't stop singing. They just keep going on, and they're having a great time. And then, so there's 4 times when they go in and out, and every time they were just going, and I tried to put little pitch cues in so that they would hit the note, and then they would hit like a third above the note because they were too excited, and then they would just do their thing. It all worked out beautifully, and I learned a really important lesson within this space, which is that I am not the master of this space, and they're wonderful musicians, and it'll sound great. So it's whereas the orchestra, people are going like, oh crap, they're playing where they're not supposed to play. What do we do now? Well, just keep going, it'll work out. It'll be fine. There is a wonderful website that the Toronto Symphony put together as part of their Canada 150 celebration, which includes an interview with Inukshuk, where she talks a little bit about Inuit throat singing. So I'm just going to play a little bit of that.
My name is Inukshuk Aksalna, and I'm a throat singer, and I'm here to perform with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. Somebody who has never heard throat singing before, it's a very weird sound, because a lot of it is with your throat and your stomach and a lot of breathing. So that's what you'll hear, and that's what you'll see when you first come across throat singing. Sometimes throat singing was a game. The two women would try and compete with each other. You would speed up and slow down and change the sound with your partner. And then whoever laughs first is usually the loser. So what we do is we mimic nature. We have different songs, such as The Wind, a song called The River. So that's the flowing river in the spring and summer, and basically all the other little things that are around. If you close your eyes and listen to our songs, then you'll be able to hear the wind, or you'll be able to hear the geese flying. There's also another throat song, which I was taught by a lady from northern Quebec, and it's called Tl'a. And so the story behind this song is a little girl had some puppies, and she wanted her favorite puppy to be the lead dog of her dad's dog team. And so she would sing this song to the little puppy in hopes that it would become the lead dog of the dog team. Throat singing was never as popular when I was younger as it is now because of residential school, essentially. Inuit were forced to assimilate, and so a lot of the arts side of the Inuit culture were taken away, or we were told not to do it or practice it. Throat singing is, it's kind of making a comeback in the Inuit culture over the last 20 to 25 years. The CBC put on what they call the True North concert in 93 or 94. And that's the very first time I heard live throat singing. So I was about 14 when I first heard it, and I knew that I wanted to learn how to do it. Throat singing is really, really important, as it is one tiny aspect of Inuit culture. And to be able to pass that on to the next generation is really important, which is why I have learned how over 20 years. It's really important to be able to expose Canada and the rest of the world to throat singing, to the arts side of Inuit culture, and to be able to educate people where Inuit come from and where we hope to go with promoting our culture.
I won.
So I tried to do my best to bring components of Inuit music into the Western culture in a parallel way. So one of the things they do in throat singing is they hawk it back and forth. So each one sings one note of the melody. They share it back and forth, which is something that happened in European music quite commonly in the Renaissance period. And so within the trombone section or whatever, the trombones are hawking back and forth with the same tune, only in the Western way than they would be with the Inuit song. So it was, I thought, a really happy experience for me to work with them on that. But it brought forward a number of questions. It's a question of like, okay, who gets paid for what? And who can own what? So am I the owner of the piece because I composed the piece, but I didn't compose all of the piece, they improvised the piece, and so in our Western culture, I get a commission, and I get a royalty, and they get a performance fee. But is that fair, and how do we do that? So I originally thought, I put my name on the piece originally, and let other orchestras do it. And then when we did the work with Toronto, we were having dinner, and they just said they get really sad when anybody else sings the piece because it's their piece, and they would like to be involved. So since that time, I've said, no, if you want to play the piece, Pauline and Inukshuk have to be the people who sing as part of, because it's their piece as well as mine. And we've had orchestras in Europe want to do the piece, and they always say, well, just record it and we'll play the tape, for this. And I said, no, you can't do that. That's really not part of it, because it's all, we start every performance with Pauline and Inukshuk explaining about Inuit throat singing and showing different kinds of songs, and it becomes a cultural experience for everyone. So that's really a hallmark, I think, of the work that I've been trying to do, collaborating with other Indigenous musicians in different cultures. So one that I'm very proud of recently was the 2021 piece, Snewíyalh tl'a Stakw, which was done with the Electra Women's Choir. So the initial concept came from an ethnomusicologist in town, Jeanette Gallant, who had been working on some water protocols with Cree First Nations. And she came and said, oh, we should really do something with water protocols out here, so important for the Salish peoples. And so they tried to do this project for a while, and they just weren't getting the traction that they needed. So finally they came in and talked to me, and they said, well, you're an Indigenous composer, you can write the music. And I said, okay, I have a few problems. First of all, yes, I'm an Indigenous composer, but I'm not from this territory, so I don't really have a personal connection to the water protocols of this land. And water protocols tend to be female. They're feminine, not masculine. The men do fire protocols, the women do water protocols. So I've got two strikes against me. And so I said, the only way I could possibly be part of this project is if you make the commitment to connect to the people of the land, and that you take guidance from them about the water protocols, and I'm happy to work within that structure as a partner within the process. So it was about engaging with the community. And we were very fortunate that Electra had already made some good connections, both to Hwaskwiyam and to Squamish. And so there were a number of women and other elders as well that were involved in the project that helped us to learn and helped to guide the form and structure of the piece. So I'm going to play just a little bit. I think I'm going to try and go into the end.
Ochomech, village. It can also mean villagers. And when we are born into one village, that is our identity for the rest of our lives. When we introduce ourselves, I say, Tzitsaichema Queen Kwashamen, Tina Chan tl'a Aslaan Ochomech. Tzitsaichema is my name, and I come from the village of Aslaan. And this would help our elders know exactly who I am, which family I come from, which village I come from, and the waters that surround me. And it all means wa me'yam. It is all a ripple effect, because who we are affects not only our elders, but also our children, our future generations, for they need to know who they come from, where they come from, and which village they come from.
So that's the last movement of that piece, which in English is Teachings of the Water. And one of the interesting things that I've tried to do with that piece is build on the concept of protocols. So when one is in a new territory, in a new Indigenous territory, one needs to follow the protocols of the owners and caretakers of that land. And so what I'm asking people who want to go that next step and not, it's great for people to sing the piece as it was created, to understand more about the Squamish tradition and about the Coast Salish protocols of water and how important it is here. But it's another thing to go and take the invitation to connect more to your land. So if this piece is done in Toronto or in Mexico, the hope is that the choir will connect to the First Nations and Indigenous caretakers of that land. They will make friends. They will learn about the protocols there, and that they will replace the Squamish text with text that is appropriate to the protocols and language of the people in the land where the music is being performed. So it's a new concept, and it's something that's, it certainly exists in many other kinds of music and has been used with music for many years, also as part of the colonization process. I mean, if we look at what happened in Quebec, a lot of hymns were translated into Mohawk to help convert the Mohawk to Christianity. So I'm hoping that we can kind of do the reverse a little bit with this, and that we can take the notes of this piece and use it to decolonize, to connect with the Indigenous people where this piece is done. So just one last little bit, I'm going to mention a piece that I worked on about 2 years ago. It was premiered last summer at Harbourfront in Toronto. And this piece is called Métis Songs. It's a set of 3 songs for mezzo-soprano and string quartet. And I worked on this with Métis singer from Toronto, Rebecca Cuddy, and a string quartet of young musicians that included my 2 kids, who are both here. One plays violin, one plays cello. So it was a lot of fun to have more of the Métis family involved in the piece. It's a set of 3 songs that kind of very quickly goes over the history of Métis. The first song, we picked or selected a text by Pierre Facon. Pierre Facon was the first known Métis composer from the late 1700s. He was a very important character within Manitoba. At that time, it was still called the Northwest or Red River. And we have a number of his songs, but one of the things that happened with a lot of non-Western music, and particularly with Indigenous music, not just in Canada but all over the world, is that white musicians would go into communities, they would listen to someone who would sing a song, and then they would correct it. So they would write it down. They would fix all the funny notes that didn't fit into European system. They would fix the weird rhythms, and they would make it very square. So there's a number of articles about Pierre Facon's music. One in particular, very famous piece that's in English known as the Battle of Frog Plain, which was this clash between the Métis and the army from Ontario, where the Métis won. And it was the first kind of time that they felt as a nation that they were defending their territory. So this is the story of this particular battle. I have been to Frog Plain. It's a kind of new subdivision in Winnipeg right now. There's a little park and a little statue that proclaims that this was the Frog Plain. It's kind of sad. But it was known because the frogs lived in the swamp on this plain. And if you've been to Manitoba and you hear frog time, it's like, it's loud. They're serious, but of course they've been pushed out now. But he talks and tells the story in a very old bardic style, as you would, around a campfire and the canoe, where you're saying, hey, I'm going to tell you this story, and this is all the great deeds of the Métis people, and these crazy English people were doing this, and they did that, and they were yelling, and there was shooting, and a bunch of people died, and we were triumphant, and we scared them away, and they ran over the hills, and all this kind of stuff. So the piece is done in this very much an old stand and deliver kind of style. that tells the story. And what I did was I found a version that had been transcribed many, many years later. So it was transcribed in the 1950s from an old Métis singer who did it in the old style. He didn't do it in the Anglophone way that we now know. It's a very popular fiddle tune. It's in folk song books. But he did it and it's so very irregular. The phrases aren't 4 and 4. There's like 2 and 8 and 5 and 3 and extra beats thrown in if you have an extra word that you need. So I've tried to reclaim some of that, and the language is French Michif. So there's Cree Michif, there's French Michif, there's several versions of Cree Michif, there's North and South, but this is in French Michif, and in Manitoba we basically say we speak the bad French. So it's got some funny, if you're trying to listen to the words as a French-speaking person, you'll probably miss a lot of it. But here's a little bit of that song. You listen to the whole story because just getting warmed up to tell you all the horrible things that the men from Orkney did. So that's the first song. The middle song is called My People Will Sleep, and Snewíyalh said, my people will sleep for 100 years and then they'll be awakened by the artists. So I'm hoping that now we're at the stage where there are enough Métis artists that our people will be waking up. But that's a kind of vocalese, so there's no text in that one. And then the last movement found this wonderful poem by Gregory Schofield, a Métis poet who teaches at the University of Victoria. And it's called Since When, and it basically talks about this reclamation of Métis identity in our time. So here's a little bit of that.
Since when did I lose my step? In 2006, detectable by the check of the census, I became the 389,785th person to name myself Métis. Not the little man Métis, not the accented Métis, but the swinging I'm jigging through this mine of invisibility. I'm again stepping on their toes, reel in, reel out. Real is what I'm dancing about, Métis, in 2006. Check by check,
So, I'm hoping that these songs, they should have been out on an album already. I'm just waiting for the album cover, so it should be out in September, I'm hoping, and available on Spotify. They're fun songs for me, and it's part of this reclaiming my own identity, but also supporting other Métis as we reclaim our identity and our role in this experiment, I guess, that we're calling Canada right now. We'll just have to see how that all goes, and the idea of these many layers of truth that we stack up one on top of the other. You know, thinking about the history of Chinese Canadians, you know, who came, of Indo-Canadians, you know, the head tax and all of the horrible things that are part of Canadian history, yet we're all here and trying to find a good relationship with each other and with the land that we're on, and trying to be something more than just a bunch of people who happen to live in the same place. And so for me, my work in the next few years, I think, continues to be a desire to mine my own identity, because a lot of, as someone who grew up not knowing the full truth of my identity, I've always been trying to say, who am I? And so when I was a graduate student, I thought, well, I'm part of the international new music community, and I should write like the Germans or the French are, or the Japanese, because we're all part of this new music community that's defining itself. And that's kind of proven to be, we're going in the opposite direction now, because rather than being some kind of homogeneous community, we're trying to reflect the places we are, to be the best people that we can be here in Vancouver, from all the different traditions that we come from, and with all the different relationships that we have to each other and to the place that we're in. So I do hope that music can play an important role in that. For me, I now often say, truth comes before reconciliation. We have to admit and recognize the truth of our history, the truth of where we come from, the realities of these complex and often very difficult historical relationships, and that have come into the current time. And that decolonization is important because it helps to make space for the many different ways of manifesting ourselves in our communities. And that indigenization for me is important because I need to be grounded more fully in who I am in this place, and the reality of where I came from, and the fact that I have two families that I love very much, and that both contributed in their own weird and wonderful ways to my ideas about who I am at this time, and my education and the people that I've worked with. So I think it's important to embrace these things, to recognize and name the truth, and then to reconcile that with where we are now and how we can be better together. So as I said, I hope the music helps us with that, and I will end with that and ask if anybody has any questions. Yeah, and I think that's a real challenge for a lot of folks who aren't living on their traditional territory, you know, because you are far away and trying to figure out how to contribute and how to reflect yourself, I guess, you know, so that you can make statements as an artist. And I guess my experience, because now I'm an uninvited guest on this territory, but when I meet and talk and work with musicians from here who are from this territory, they're so generous. They're, you know, despite the many challenges that our Indigenous communities have, they're as hopeful for those who've come from other places to this territory as they are for themselves. I think we're all in some ways fighting against the restrictions of traditional European, North American society, because it's not that it doesn't have positive things, but it's quite laden with barriers and things that prohibit us from doing things. And so I think it's really, again, about being part of the decolonization process to say, okay, I mean, I always think it's so crazy that I have to say I live in British Columbia. You know, like, what a wacky thing to say. British Columbia. What does that have to do with anything other than some guy showed up and happened to have a bigger boat than the other guy? You know what I mean? It's like, and we have this structure where it's about, but I think that Western society is at a place where it is hoping, I mean, we're very aspirational. I always think about this at UBC. We're very aspirational. We would like to do these things. We don't know how to do them. We're really bad at doing them, like making space, but we want to do them. So it's like, we're better that you're part of us and that we're all trying to talk about these feelings that we have and these concerns that we have about going forward. How can we, I don't ever want to feel 40 below again unless I really have to, so I don't want to go back to Manitoba. I love Manitoba, but I lived there for a long time and it's really cold in the winter and it makes me want to go to Mexico, so, and I booked my holiday to Mexico today. But anyway, that's another story. But it's one of those things where, I don't think we want to throw out the positive things. We want to try and get or minimize the negative things and work together to express who we are in this place. So I think there's a lot that you can say about how you feel here, and that the more you talk about that, the more differently you'll feel. So only by engaging with the people around you and the place that you're in can you celebrate you in that space. So I think it's important for us to feel like we can work together. And that's one of the things I often people say, well, how can I help with what Khmaskwim is going through? And I'm going like, whoa, Khmaskwim needs to be able to do that. That's just recolonizing if we think that we're going to help that. We want to make space for them and be as supportive as we can as they try and figure out how they fit in. And we need to do the same thing, trying to figure out, okay, what does it mean to be me here now? Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Bernie, I think Bernie's fantastic. And I think that decolonization is, depending on where you are under the heel of it, it makes you madder or not, right? And so I think that we chafe often as artists and professors against the restrictions and the prohibitions of colonial structure, because it often leads to less good decision making. It doesn't allow people to feel part of the process. And yet, if you're in a more traditional community, often unless you're an elder, you're not part of that process in the same way. So every community is quite different as, in terms of how power flows and how decisions are made. And none of them are perfect. I mean, they all reflect history and often abuse that people have lived through. And so, copyright, for example, was something that the Europeans thought up to try and protect people who had been abused. The creators were abused and people were taking their things and making money on them and they were starving. So it starts out as a good idea and then it ends up that you can't do something because Disney wants to protect Mickey Mouse for another 75 years. So it's a kind of wacky thing. So I guess, for me, decolonization is something that you don't have to be Indigenous to think about. But I think indigenization is more of a personal thing where I'm trying to figure out how I can make sure that within my thinking that the traditions of my people are particularly more towards the surface of how I'm doing things. Within the university context, for example, I try and use some of the Indigenous ideas of this territory when I'm engaging with others. So for example, if we're having a meeting, we'll try and use a talking circle approach where we will go counterclockwise because in this territory, that's the way people speak, that it's your turn going counterclockwise. In where I'm from, it's clockwise. So it depends on whether you're following the moon or what your tradition is. So just remembering that those Indigenous values and ways of knowing and doing are equally valuable in the decision making. Doesn't mean that you're going to use them yourself, but and I think about it particularly in the context of tenure at the university. So if one is an Indigenous scholar and you're going to work with your community, that the likelihood is it will take you 3 times as long to complete the project as if you were using a Western methodology. And so to recognize the indigeneity of that particular approach to publication and research is imperative that the university does that. I don't necessarily think that a white scholar needs to use that process, and in some cases probably shouldn't, because they're not part of that community and they're a bit invasive as they go in there and do that. Not that you can't, but you have to be very careful as you do it. So I think the balance is that we have to recognize Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and that their validity is equal to anything under Canadian law. So like my big problem with Snewíyalh tl'a Stakw is knowing how to credit Rebecca as the generator of the language in the work. Because under European Canadian law, I have to register who wrote the text. And she didn't write the text, she gifted me text from her language around things, around protocols. So is it the community that should be getting the pennies of royalties that we're gonna get, or is it Rebecca? And we're still trying to work our way through that. Like, you can't register a community as the creator of the text. The legal system just doesn't know how to do that. Whereas if you look at Australia, rivers, for example, are considered, they're considered living beings. So they have rights under the law as a river. You know, so that's a really different way of thinking about things. It's an Indigenous way of thinking about things. So there's a lot of ways that indigeneity can manifest itself within the structures of our modern society. We just have to work harder at it.
Since when did I lose my step?